Speed can be trained, speed can be improved, and that starts with technique. But you can't fix a problem if you don't know what it is or you can't actually put your finger on it. That's why analyzing sprinting video, simply just using an iPhone, is super impactful in a speed training journey. So I have 3 videos with me today, 1 top speed and 2 acceleration. I'm super excited just to share my thought process, how my coach's eye works and what I look for, and things you can take away when you start analyzing your sprint videos. Let's do it. All right, let's start with our top speed video. We'll watch it through just a few times, and all these videos will be in slow-mo, which is super impactful when you are looking at sprinting technique, because sprinting just happens so fast that at a normal 30 frames per second video, it just gets a little bit blurry when you try to slow it down. So most phones can do slow-mo, which is typically 120 or 240 FPS, which means in 1 second it's taking at least 120 pictures, which is why it is way less blurry. So when I'm looking at sprinting technique, I work from the ground up, and what are my big rocks? So from the ground up, how is the foot hitting the ground? Next, what are their shapes or positions that they're hitting? And last, just how does it look? Let's start with how the foot hits the ground. My first instincts are telling me that this is a super fast guy already, just because of how stiff and bouncy his lower leg is. So if we look at this ground contact, a little toesy, but not that much cave or collapse on the ankle. Pretty stiff. Let's look at one more ground contact. A little bit of external rotation, but that's all right. So next, where is he hitting the ground relative to his hips? Bang. Pretty tall, a little bit bent at the waist, but right underneath his hips. So in top speed, at least, we can go through the 5 main positions of top speed sprinting, or a kilogram. And I have a video on this that I'll put in the show notes. But there's 5 main positions of top speed sprinting. First is toe off. Next is max vertical projection. Both look pretty good. Next is strike, when the back thigh is completely vertical. Next is touchdown, and then full support when he's as collapsed or as close to the ground as possible. So the big things that I look for, or that's going to be off, is first knee drive low, which knee drive is pretty solid. The foot strike is underneath the hips, but the big thing you have to look for in top speed sprinting is normally an athlete, they'll have a little gap in between their knees, like right there, when they're at touchdown. So this shows me that this athlete is on time. Everything's happening kind of when it should be. So overall, a pretty solid video, but here's what I would improve. So a little bit hunched over, you can kind of see at the waist and the shoulders. So I would cue them to get taller or straighter, but still to maintain that little bit of a forward lean, because that's probably a big misconception in top speed sprinting is, yes, we're tall and we're upright and we're bouncy, but we're not truly 90 degrees upright. We're more like 88, 87, still with a little bit of forward lean. So I would just cue to stay a little bit taller and just feel like his chest and hips are a little bit higher. A drill I would do is our single leg hurdle step overs, because his ankles never really get too dorsiflexed in front of his body. So by isolating one leg at a time, we'll be able to really focus on keeping the ankles dorsiflexed, and I would actually cue to hit with a flat foot, because this athlete is so toesy. When they actually sprint, they're never going to hit completely flat anyways, because in speed training, when we want to work on something, we exaggerate the opposite. Overall, pretty fast, pretty bouncy video. Don't have too many things to touch on. Next one. This video and acceleration. And acceleration, there's a little bit more drawing and stuff that goes into it. There's a lot more that can kind of go wrong, if that makes sense. So this is in slow-mo again. Let's watch it a few times through. Now this is only like a 3-step acceleration. 1, 2, 3. And when people decel and they start to slow down, that usually changes their technique a little bit. So I'm not too concerned with that third step right there. So first, blocks are super hard, and I would guess that this is probably high school age. Pretty decent shapes. So that's where I'm going to start, because he's coming out of blocks, obviously, so I can't look at the foot strike. But you know, if we look at this angle right here, coming out pretty low, and this isn't perfectly perpendicular, but you get the point. Anyways, this is a very aggressive angle. If we look at the angle of his thigh split, big thigh split right here. What is this, 100 degrees? 110 depending on how I draw it. And if we look at these arms, ginormous shapes of the arms, like relative to his body. So ginormous shapes, that's great. But with this athlete, if we go a few more frames forwards, this front foot kind of goes a little bit out. So if we look at his body angle versus his shin angle, in acceleration, we always want those to be pretty similar. So this athlete reaches a little bit, and we call that as more of like a dead foot strike. It's not very active. So he comes up on his first step and just hits the ground straight down, which is not going to give us a very good and bouncy or active foot strike on that first step, because the ground hits his back equal and opposite. So we actually want what's called negative foot speed. It sounds fancier than it is we want our foot on the first step coming up, moving this way when it hits the ground, so then the ground can push us forwards where we want to go. So a little reachy, a little dead, and pretty in front of his body. So if that's where his hips are, and that's where his foot is striking, versus in pretty similar to top speed, we want to hit underneath our hips, or in acceleration, maybe a little bit behind our hips. So just a little reaching from his body with a kind of dead foot strike. So then that's going to lead us to have a way longer ground contact, bunch of collapse, because when we're in front of our body with our foot strike, we have to wait and kind of roll over that foot to then get in front to create an angle to then push again. So then if we look at this second step, very complementary here. Same thing. Pretty decent arms. The one in front could get a little bigger, but nice arms as well. We can look at this thigh split right here. Pretty big on the second step. So the angle of his second step, we're comparing apples to apples, not apples to oranges. So I can't say, oh, 53, this is what it is, because the angle of the camera versus how he's sprinting, it's not really about 53, but it's about what it is compared to his first step. So a pretty big increase in angle. We only want to raise like 3 to 5 degrees per step, and the higher level athlete, the stronger, the less degrees, or the lower on that range. And the younger and weaker, they're going to have more increase per step. But a pretty big increase because of that first step and it being kind of reachy and kind of dead and not very active. So we're kind of out in front on the first step, increased ground contact, a super nice second step. So if we look at like right here, so that's where his foot is, and then see how it creates a little bit of this backwards negative foot speed that I was talking about. So if we look at his foot, it comes up, and then it goes a little bit backwards. And let's look at where he's striking relative to his hips. Bang, pretty good. So we had a good second step, a little reachy first step, but then we get a little reachy again, so huge thigh split. That might even be a little bigger than his first step. But I do want to point out and draw on his shin versus his body. A huge discrepancy, big difference. We would call that shin casting. It's kind of just going in front of him. So if we play that back from the beginning with this concept in mind, in front, ginormous step, And then it's kind of just doing this like back and forth of dead, kind of reaching in front. He's got a roll. Super nice step. So this foot is now trailing behind because it had to be on the ground, his right foot. That foot right there with a way longer ground contact. So then to compensate, it swings through super fast and aggressively. And if we look at this ground contact and kind of like the gap right there, we know that he's a little bit behind, but it makes sense because he's a little bit too big on that first step. So how I would cue and fix this. So we know big shapes, looks like a pretty buff dude, but basically just fixing that first step. So I would cue, if we look like his foot never gets too high off the ground, it's actually pretty decent, but I would cue, or I would probably start with drills first. I would start with wall switches or a switch series or whatever it is, just learning how to put up and replace the thighs really fast and how to work on an aggressive angle and a negative foot speed strike. So something like a wall where you can really get aggressive in your angle, or a sled that you can really lean into it, or something like a super heavy resisted run where you basically have to have a negative foot speed strike to push yourself forwards to fight against the sled. So that's kind of what I would do to help fix this negative foot speed first step issue. So basically he's just in the air too long. Like if he went right here to straight back down, if he went from this position immediately just back down, but instead he's in the air, a little casty, a little reachy. But it's cool to see how all these steps are connected. Last video. All right, we have another acceleration, and immediately the first thing that came to my mind that just jumped out at me was this super crouched starting position. So he's maybe one shoe length off the line, but his back foot or his farther foot looks almost in line with his front foot. So super crowded. So I'd start with a little bit of positioning, and this angle right here on this front knee is way too bent. So coaching a 40 start, a 3-point stance, is the front knee I think is 90 degrees ish, and the back knee is 130 ish. Don't quote me on that. But basically we want to feel somewhere in between like a regular squat and standing up super tall. So always just like an athletic stance. So it should feel bent, but not too bent to where like you're stuck in the mud. So think about kind of like the amount of knee flexion in a vertical jump. Not too much, it's definitely some, but you still feel very athletic and you can get out of that position pretty well. But let's just watch this video a few times through. Right. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, not bad. So similar to our top speed sprinting, I still start from the ground up, and then I take a step back and ask, what are the shapes, the positions? Obviously can't start with the ground on the first step, but let's look at this position right here. Our shapes. So ginormous thigh split. Pretty nice right there. Arms look pretty nice, and overall decent, just overall posture from head to toe. So a huge, ginormous first step, but let's see where he goes from here, mainly with this front foot. So see how it just goes here, straight down to the ground, or a little bit in front. And we can look at these bleachers for reference. So at like the top, all he does is go a little bit forwards instead of back. So if we look at touchdown, his hips versus where his foot is hitting, definitely in front, not crazy in front, but definitely more in front than what we would want for a typical first step in acceleration. So same thing as the other video, because we are in front of our bodies, in order to create the angles we need to create to continue accelerating and creating speed, we have to have a long ground contact and just basically roll over it So if my foot hits the ground here and the rest of my body's back here, I'm gonna have to wait, I'm gonna have to roll, so then I get this angle to then go. Versus if I hit the ground and my foot is like right underneath, well, I already have that angle. So super long ground contact, a bunch of ankle collapse, and just kind of mushy. Pretty decent position, but if we look at bang, body angle, shin angle, similar-ish, but a little casty. So because he struck the ground in front of himself and he had that longer ground contact, well then his leg is gonna have more time for kind of bad stuff to happen and kind of reach in front of him. And same thing, we can use this kind of shed for reference, that it never really goes backwards. It kind of just goes down. A bunch of collapse as well, and kind of in front of his body or his hips. First, I think some sort of plyometrics, rudimentary series, ankle hops, pogos, whatever it is, just to get some bounce and elasticity out of his ankles. And second, just learning, same thing as the other video, he looks big, strong, aggressive, but I think cleaning up the starting position, getting a little bit stiffer ankles, as well as learning how to switch and get this negative foot speed strike with wall drills, heavier sleds, heavier running where we can work on this angle and where we have to hit the ground down and back to support that aggressive ankle, I think would be awesome options. So there you have it. 3 sprinting videos, my coach's eye, my thought process, how I start from the ground up, shapes, and think what drills are going to be simple and make the biggest difference.